Welcome back to the program. We are joined again by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a combat veteran, author of many books on military strategy, and also a former senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. So thank you very much for coming back on the program.
Oh, thank you, Glenn. I appreciate it.
So when Trump, after spending his campaign talking about the folly of expanding NATO, in February we learned that there should be no NATO, no security guarantees, and Ukraine had to accept territorial concessions. Then he went back, argued for an unconditional ceasefire. He meant Putin meets in Alaska. Suddenly, he recognizes ceasefire is not peace after all, and he wants to also address the underlying causes as he had referenced during his campaign. Now we're yet again back to ceasefire, and likely there will be no meeting in Budapest. So, what is actually happening here? This is starting to feel less like 4D chess and more like a ridiculous reality show where everyone is being kept on their toes the whole time. How do you make sense of this?
Well, clearly he's not the president of peace. He's the president of perpetual confusion. He tends to vacillate between two poles on every subject. So it's very difficult to follow the man, as you've already pointed to all of the contradictions. But at this particular point in time, I think we have to come to the realization that he's certainly not interested in ending the conflict in Ukraine any longer. If anything, he's turned away from it, and he's made rather strident outcome. We know that a ceasefire is just that, a ceasefire. It's temporary. Now, can you have temporary armistices that last 20 or 30 years? I suppose you can. We've had that in Korea. But I don't think that's the solution that Europe or most Europeans want in Ukraine. I think they'd like to see an end to the fighting. But to get there, you have to sign on for a strategic arrangement with Russia that codifies Russia's relationship with the rest of Europe. That's something that he should welcome, in my judgment. That would be a serious matter that constitutes an enduring legacy, if you will. But I don't see any evidence that he's interested in any enduring legacy. He still seems to be in the hunt for anything that he can quote unquote call a win. You know, I met with President Putin. I charmed him. He made a deal. We got a ceasefire. Peace is breaking out. Where's my Nobel Peace Prize? Unless he can say something like that, he's not terribly interested. It's an unfortunate set of circumstances, and I don't think there's any understanding at all right now of what Russia will do next. I think we see evidence right now already down in Kherson. The Russians have now established a bridgehead across the Dnieper River. I think we're going to see more Russian forces cross that river down south. I've always thought that they would want to retake Odessa, which historically is a Russian city, has nothing to do with Ukraine. It was still a Russian-speaking city when the Ukrainians drove its Russian population and Russian speakers out back in 2014. So I think that's on the menu. I would be very surprised if we didn't see something similar happen with Kharkov. And we see, near Liman and Slovyansk, ongoing Russian advances. So I think President Putin has held his council of war and said, fine, there's no reason for us any longer to exercise restraint on the ground. We'll press ahead. That's unfortunate. At the same time, he's turning his attention increasingly to Venezuela. And he pretends that the ceasefire in Gaza is some sort of a permanent outcome. There's no evidence for that. And I don't know what we're going to see happen in Gaza, although I think with the arrival of Kushner and Witkoff, the real estate oligarchs, we can look forward to some attempt to at least take 50% of Gaza and turn it into some sort of Israeli Disney World of real estate expansion. The whole thing is bizarre, and no one that I know that's serious at all about Venezuela has figured out why we want to go into Venezuela and enact suddenly out of nowhere regime change. And again, this was something that you mentioned earlier. President Trump had railed against regime change, as a pointless and self-defeating. All of a sudden, he's in the forefront of demanding it in Venezuela, of all places. Now there's talk about Colombia. I don't know. Perhaps he's going to go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war, although I doubt it.
Seems like a good way of getting millions of refugees yet again on the march north, though. It's again, it looks like a lot of self-harm. But on, I think you're right, though, with the Russians, they seem to be stepping it up now a bit, also with this seemingly determination to turn off all the lights across Ukraine. But you do see that, well, we now see that the British used the Storm Shadow to attack a chemical plant in Bryansk. A few days ago, we got a report from Russian intelligence, FSB, that the attack on their nuclear deterrent, that the British were behind this. And, so there's more and more talk about direct war. We indeed saw the Europeans, they got quite excited when it sounded like Trump might send Tomahawks, which would be operated by American contractors, and they could carry nuclear warheads. And yet this was, Christmas time almost across European capitals. And of course, now Trump is putting sanctions on Russian oil companies, which even Biden didn't want to do. I mean, do you see the threat of a direct war looming, or do you see any indications that the Russians or others are preparing for it? Or is it
Well,
rhetoric?
I think he's reconsidered the wisdom of sending the Tomahawks. As you point out, mission planning and execution is entirely in the hands of Americans. That means Americans on the ground somewhere west of the Dnieper River launching Tomahawk missiles into Russia. I think he thought, well, this is probably not a good idea, and indeed it's a very bad idea. But there was something else. And I think there's been a sudden realization that our resources are not limitless. One of the few coherent moments that I've heard from him is where he talked specifically about the numbers of weapons and munitions and resources on the military side that we need for our own defense, and that we've poured about as much as we possibly can into Ukraine. Now, that may explain the sudden use of the Storm Shadow by the British. Who knows? The British, specifically MI6, and selected elements of the British military establishment have been in Ukraine from the very beginning and are into this war up till their necks. I don't know what the Russians plan to do in the future, but I would not be surprised to see some serious action taken against the British. The place, the timing, I can't anticipate that. I just don't know. But at some point, I think the Russians are annoyed. Remember, the Russians know that the British have very, very small armed forces. The British have bankrupted themselves. They're overspent. They could perhaps ship 20, 30,000 troops, to Russia or to Poland. That's about it. I don't see any evidence that they're going to implement national service and try to draft people to go fight in Ukraine. Situation in France is about the same, and France is even more volatile internally than Great Britain is. I don't think the French want to let the army go for fear that things could come unglued in France. So we've got lots of sort of empty threats coming from the Europeans. The Russians know that. And I think as a result, the Russians will continue to exercise restraint, but at the same time, they're going to move forward in Ukraine because, contrary to what a lot of people think, they'd actually like to see this war end. They don't really want to govern Western Ukraine. That would be a catastrophe for them. They know the population there doesn't want them, and they don't want that population inside Russia. They're really only interested in other Russians, people that are speaking Russian, that want to be part of Russia, being under Russian control. But every time I or anybody else who knows anything about Russia says this, we're silenced. We're told, no, you're wrong. He wants to conquer Europe. And of course, that would require universal service and national mobilization. Now, here's something that people in the West don't get. The Russians can do that. They can mobilize Russia for a total war. They don't want to, but it can be done. And people think, oh, well, if we push them to mobilize for all-out war against us, once again, this will fatally weaken the Putin government, and he will be overthrown. So it's just a sort of repetition of stupidity and lies over and over and over again. But in the meantime, I think we're going to see the Russians press forward to the river. I think they're going to cross down in the south. I'd be very surprised if they don't move closer and closer to Kiev, and at some point act against the government that's in Kiev. But, you know, the Russians have tried to avoid this. They've tried to find some sort of middle ground that was acceptable. But if we're not willing to listen, what's the point? And I'm afraid in the final analysis, that turned out to be the case with Trump. So Trump is now Biden, too, as far as the Russia is concerned, only, as you pointed out, with the oil sanctions, maybe worse.
It's also well, I guess if he really wanted peace, he would have to divorce himself a little bit from the delusion that he's merely, a peacemaker, a third party mediator, because I'm expecting to hear some talk about NATO if we're gonna see the end of this war. But he does seem almost as if he convinced himself that this is simply a Russia-Ukraine war, and it's about territory. And he's the guy on the side just trying to get these two countries with ancient hatred to come together. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. But you mentioned before Venezuela, but now that the war on Russia is, again, it's become now Trump's war. We have now a possible second war against Iran, also on Trump's initiative, possible war with Venezuela. The Gaza peace hardly seems as it's going to hold. How are Americans reacting to this, his base? Because, is Trump with the globalist? I mean, where is America first now? Sorry, that was a lot of questions.
Well, before we leave Russia and that subject, I think we should point to what looks like increasingly a civil war inside the European Union and NATO. We have these explosions, and I'm not sure what they've destroyed or whether or not they're all real, but there have been explosions on the ground, I'm told, in Romania. Whether or not there was